In the frost-kissed dawn of November 15, 1875, groundskeeper Willem van der Berg made a discovery that would haunt him until his dying breath. As he entered the dormitory of St. Augustine's Boys' Choir School to wake the students for morning prayers, he found 12 beds empty, not merely unoccupied, but abandoned with a precision that defied explanation. The linens lay undisturbed, folded with military exactness. Personal belongings remained exactly where they had been placed the evening before. Prayer books open to marked passages, wooden combs aligned on nightstands, small treasures from home arranged with the careful attention of boys who cherished few possessions. What struck van der Berg most profoundly was the silence. For 7 years he had awakened each morning to the gentle stirring of 43 young voices beginning their daily devotions. Now 31 boys remained, but they made no sound. They sat upright in their beds with vacant eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the dormitory walls, their lips moving in silent prayer, their bodies swaying in perfect unison to music only they could hear. Van der Berg's hands trembled as he approached the nearest child, a boy of perhaps 10, whose golden hair caught the pale morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Master Timothy," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. The child turned toward him with mechanical precision, his blue eyes reflecting nothing. No recognition, no fear, no curiosity. When Timothy spoke, his voice carried an ethereal quality that made the groundskeeper's blood freeze in his veins. "They have achieved the perfect tone," Timothy said in a voice too pure, too controlled for any mortal child. "They have been called to sing with the angels forever." The initial investigation conducted by Headmaster Elias Thorne was swift and decisive. The missing boys, he declared with solemn authority, had clearly succumbed to the worldly temptations that plagued all young souls in their journey toward spiritual perfection. They were runaways, nothing more. Boys who had abandoned their sacred calling in favor of the crude entertainments and base pleasures of the outside world. The local sheriff, a practical man named Jacob Morrison, who had known Thorne for 15 years, accepted this explanation without question. After all, what alternative could there be? But deep in the ancient forests surrounding St. Augustine's, something far more sinister had taken root. The truth lay buried beneath layers of respectability and religious devotion, hidden behind the angelic faces of children whose voices had been deemed worthy of the ultimate sacrifice. Before we continue with this chilling tale of sacred music turned unholy, this channel is only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of our nation's buried history. If you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of 1875, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. The year 1875 found America in the grip of a spiritual awakening that swept across the nation like wildfire. In the aftermath of the Civil War's devastating carnage, citizens sought redemption through religious devotion and moral purification. Sacred music in particular had achieved an almost mystical significance in American culture. The pure voices of children singing hymns were believed to possess a divine quality that could literally transport listeners closer to heaven. Wealthy families throughout the Northeast competed to have their sons trained in the most prestigious choir schools, viewing musical education as both a mark of social distinction and a pathway to spiritual elevation. St. Augustine's Boys' Choir School occupied a unique position in this cultural landscape. Established in 1863 on 200 acres of rolling hills in the remote wilderness of upstate New York, the institution had quickly gained a reputation for producing voices of otherworldly beauty. The school's isolation was considered one of its greatest assets. Located 15 miles from the nearest settlement via treacherous mountain roads, it provided the perfect environment for intensive spiritual and musical training, free from worldly distractions. The Gothic Revival architecture of the main building reflected the institution's lofty aspirations. Constructed from dark gray stone, quarried from local mountains, St. Augustine's rose 3 stories above the surrounding forest, like a medieval monastery transplanted to the American wilderness. The chapel, with its soaring spires and magnificent stained glass windows, could accommodate nearly 200 visitors for the quarterly concerts that drew audiences from as far away as New York City and Boston. These performances had become legendary among America's cultural elite, with tickets selling for enormous sums and waiting lists extending for years. The school's reputation for excellence was built on rigid discipline and total dedication to musical perfection. Boys as young as 7 were accepted into the program, typically remaining until their voices changed at adolescence. During their years at St. Augustine's, students followed a demanding schedule that began with prayers at dawn and concluded with evening devotions well after sunset. Academic instruction was limited to basic literacy and religious studies. The development of musical ability took absolute priority over all other considerations. The surrounding wilderness provided everything necessary for the school's self-sufficient operation. Extensive gardens and livestock ensured fresh food year-round, while workshops produced furniture, clothing, and other necessities. A small infirmary staffed by the school's own medical personnel handled routine health matters, eliminating the need for outside doctors who might ask inconvenient questions about the institution's methods. This isolation, originally viewed as a blessing, would ultimately enable horrors that defied comprehension. Parents who sent their sons to St. Augustine's did so with complete faith in the institution's noble mission. The school's literature promised not merely musical training, but complete character formation. The transformation of ordinary boys into young men of exceptional virtue and spiritual refinement. Letters from former students and their families testified to remarkable transformations in behavior and temperament. Boys who had been troublesome or rebellious became models of obedience and devotion. The few who returned home during the school's operation appeared to have achieved an almost supernatural level of discipline and spiritual focus. What these testimonials failed to mention was the strange quality that characterized all graduates of St. Augustine's intensive program. Former students spoke in measured, controlled tones that never varied in pitch or emotion. Their eyes held a distant quality, as if they were perpetually listening to music only they could hear. Most unsettling of all, they displayed an uncanny uniformity in their responses to questions about their experiences at the school, as if they were reciting carefully rehearsed answers rather than sharing genuine memories. The institution's growing reputation attracted the attention of European musical authorities who corresponded regularly with the school's faculty about advanced techniques for vocal development. These exchanges, conducted through private letters that bypassed normal academic channels, discussed methods for achieving perfect pitch and tone quality that surpassed anything being attempted in conventional conservatories. The European correspondents were particularly interested in the school's apparent ability to preserve and enhance young voices well beyond the normal age, when boys' voices typically change. At the heart of St. Augustine's success stood 3 men whose dedication to musical perfection bordered on obsession. Each brought unique talents and disturbing predilections that would combine to create one of the most systematic programs of human experimentation ever conducted on American soil. Headmaster Elias Thorne commanded respect and fear in equal measure from everyone who encountered him. A tall, imposing figure in his early 50s, Thorne possessed the bearing of a man born to authority. His piercing gray eyes seemed to penetrate the souls of those around him, while his deep voice carried the refined accent of European education. Thorne's background remained deliberately mysterious. He claimed to have studied theology and music at prestigious institutions in Germany and Austria, though no records of his attendance could be verified through normal channels. What was known about Thorne's past came from carefully controlled revelations he shared with trusted associates. He spoke of years spent in remote monasteries studying ancient techniques for spiritual purification, and of private tutoring under master musicians whose methods had been passed down through secret traditions dating back centuries. His philosophy of education centered on the concept of purification through devotion, the belief that true musical perfection could only be achieved through the complete surrender of individual will to divine purpose. Under Thorne's leadership, St. Augustine's had developed what he termed total immersion methodology. Students were not merely taught music, they were systematically reconstructed as vessels for divine expression. This process, Thorne explained to prospective parents, required the temporary suppression of worldly personality traits that interfered with spiritual development. Boys who completed the program emerged as perfected instruments of sacred music, their individual quirks and preferences refined away through intensive training that approached the level of religious conversion. Thorne's private study contained an extensive library of medical and anatomical texts that seemed oddly inappropriate for an educational administrator. Visitors who glimpsed these volumes were told they represented research into the physiological aspects of vocal production, knowledge necessary for optimizing the training process. What Thorne didn't reveal was his extensive correspondence with European physicians who specialized in experimental surgery and his growing obsession with the possibility of preserving perfect voices through direct intervention in the biological processes of vocal development. Music Master Alaric Finch presented a striking contrast to the commanding presence of Headmaster Thorne. Pale and ethereally thin, Finch moved through the halls of St. Augustine's with ghost-like silence, appearing and disappearing without warning in a manner that unnerved students and staff alike. His delicate features and almost translucent skin gave him an otherworldly appearance that perfectly matched his reputation for producing voices of supernatural beauty. Finch's musical credentials were impeccable. He claimed training at the most prestigious conservatories in Europe and spoke with authority about vocal techniques that were unknown in American musical circles. His knowledge of anatomy and physiology far exceeded what would be expected of a conventional music teacher. He could discuss the intricate workings of the larynx, vocal cords, and respiratory system with the precision of a trained physician, often illustrating his points with detailed anatomical drawings that he created with disturbing accuracy. Students under Finch's instruction underwent training regimens that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Hours-long practice sessions in soundproof chambers tested not only vocal ability, but psychological resilience. Finch demanded absolute perfection in every note, every breath, every subtle variation in tone and pitch. Boys who failed to meet his exacting standards were subjected to additional conditioning designed to eliminate the physical and mental obstacles that prevented them from achieving vocal purity. The most promising students received individual attention from Finch in private sessions that could last for days at a time. These intensive training periods took place in specially designed chambers deep within the school's basement levels, where perfect acoustic conditions allowed for the most refined analysis of vocal production. Students emerged from these sessions fundamentally changed, their voices enhanced beyond natural capability, but their personalities somehow diminished, as if the process of achieving perfect sound had required the sacrifice of essential human qualities. Finch maintained detailed records of each student's vocal development, documenting not only musical progress, but physical measurements and behavioral observations that seemed more appropriate for medical research than educational assessment. His private notebooks, written in a cipher of his own devising, contain theories about the relationship between vocal perfection and spiritual transcendence that bordered on the mystical. He believed that truly perfect voices could serve as direct conduits to divine realms, allowing those who possess them to communicate with angelic beings through pure sound. Brother Thomas completed the unholy trinity that controlled life at St. Augustine's. A man in his 60s with the gentle demeanor of a beloved grandfather, Brother Thomas served as the school's infirmarian and spiritual counselor. His kind eyes and soft-spoken manner made him the most trusted adult figure in the lives of students who had been separated from their families for months or years at a time. Boys who struggled with homesickness or academic difficulties naturally sought comfort from Brother Thomas, finding in him the parental warmth that was otherwise absent from their rigorous daily existence. Thomas's background in medicine and theology made him invaluable to the school's mission. He had trained as a physician before taking religious vows, bringing to St. Augustine's a unique combination of medical knowledge and spiritual authority. His role as infirmarian gave him intimate access to every student's physical condition, while his position as counselor provided insights into their psychological and emotional states. This dual authority allowed him to monitor the effects of the school's intensive training methods with scientific precision. What made Brother Thomas's complicity in the school's darker activities so particularly disturbing was the genuine affection he displayed toward the students under his care. He seemed to truly love the boys entrusted to his supervision, taking personal interest in their well-being and celebrating their musical achievements with paternal pride. Yet this same compassionate figure participated willingly in procedures that destroyed the very children he claimed to cherish, justifying his actions through a twisted theology that equated suffering with spiritual purification. Thomas maintained the school's medical records with meticulous attention to detail, documenting not only routine health matters, but the physiological effects of various experimental treatments administered under the guise of vocal enhancement. His infirmary contained equipment and supplies that far exceeded what would be necessary for treating typical childhood ailments, surgical instruments, chemical compounds, and restraining devices that suggested medical interventions of a far more serious nature. The relationship between these three men formed the core of St. Augustine's dark mission. Thorne provided the vision and authority necessary to attract students and maintain the school's respectable facade. Finch contributed the technical expertise required to identify and develop exceptional vocal talents. Thomas offered the medical knowledge and emotional manipulation needed to implement their increasingly extreme methods while maintaining student compliance and parental confidence. Together, they had created an institution that appeared from the outside to be a model of educational excellence and moral instruction. Parents, church officials, and community leaders viewed St. Augustine's as a shining example of American values applied to musical education. The reality hidden behind this facade was a systematic program of human experimentation that pushed the boundaries of medical science in service of an obsession with vocal perfection that had long since crossed the line into madness. The first crack in St. Augustine's carefully constructed facade appeared on a bitter December morning in 1875, when Inspector Charles Whitmore arrived unannounced at the school's gates. Whitmore, a representative of the New York State Board of Education, had been tasked with conducting routine evaluations of private institutions. His visit was meant to be a formality, a brief inspection that would rubber stamp the school's continued accreditation. What Whitmore encountered instead was an atmosphere so profoundly unsettling that it would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life. From the moment he was escorted through the school's massive oak doors, something fundamental felt wrong. The building itself seemed to swallow sound, creating an unnatural quiet that pressed against his eardrums like physical weight. Headmaster Thorne received him with perfect courtesy, offering tea and engaging in polite conversation. Yet Whitmore found himself increasingly uncomfortable in the man's presence. Thorne's gray eyes never seemed to blink, and his voice maintained the same measured tone regardless of the topic being discussed. When Whitmore mentioned the recent disappearances, Thorne's expression didn't change at all. No flicker of concern, no shadow of grief for the lost students. Boys of that age are prone to romantic notions about adventure, Thorne explained with serene indifference. Despite our best efforts to instill proper discipline, some students inevitably succumb to worldly temptations. The tour of the facility began innocuously enough. Whitmore was shown through well-appointed classrooms where the remaining 31 students sat in perfect silence, their attention focused on lessons with supernatural intensity. Not a single child fidgeted, whispered, or displayed any of the natural restlessness that characterized normal boys their age. When Whitmore attempted to make eye contact with individual students, they seemed to look through him rather than at him. The music rooms presented an even more disturbing spectacle. During a vocal exercise led by Master Finch, the boys produced sounds of such ethereal beauty that Whitmore felt tears spring unbidden to his eyes. Their voices blended with mathematical precision, creating harmonies that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the listener's soul. But as the inspector watched more closely, he began to notice details that transformed his wonder into revulsion. The boys' mouths moved with identical precision, their breathing synchronized to an inhuman degree. Their faces remained completely expressionless throughout the performance, showing no joy, no effort, no connection to the sublime music they were creating. Most disturbing of all, their voices possessed a quality that Whitmore could only describe as hollow, beautiful but somehow empty, like echoes of music rather than music itself. When one boy in the back row faltered slightly, missing a note by a fraction, Master Finch's reaction was swift and terrifying. Without breaking the rhythm of his conducting, he fixed the child with a stare of such concentrated malevolence that the boy's face went ashen. The child's voice immediately corrected, but Whitmore noticed that his hands had begun to tremble uncontrollably. Perfection requires absolute dedication, Finch explained to Whitmore after dismissing the students. These boys have learned to surrender their individual wills to the greater purpose of divine music. The transformation is quite remarkable, don't you think? Whitmore found himself unable to respond. These children had been fundamentally altered in ways that defied explanation. Their voices had achieved a level of technical perfection that exceeded anything he had heard in professional performances, but at a cost that appeared to have hollowed out their very humanity. Most troubling of all was what Whitmore didn't see during his visit. Despite Brother Thomas's detailed explanations of the school's medical facilities, the inspector was not permitted to visit the basement levels where the most intensive training allegedly took place. When he requested access to these areas, he was met with polite but firm refusal. The basement chambers are designed for our most advanced students, Brother Thomas explained with grandfatherly concern. The acoustic properties and specialized equipment require careful supervision to prevent injury. Whitmore left St. Augustine's that evening with a growing conviction that he had witnessed something far more sinister than educational innovation. However, his concerns were quickly buried in bureaucratic indifference. St. Augustine's had powerful advocates among wealthy families whose sons had allegedly benefited from the school's programs. 3 months after Inspector Whitmore's disturbing visit, witness accounts began emerging from individuals whose work brought them into contact with St. Augustine's operations. These testimonies, dismissed at the time as the imaginings of uneducated laborers, would later prove crucial evidence in understanding the true nature of the horrors being perpetrated behind the school's stone walls. Samuel Dutch, a teamster who delivered supplies to the school monthly, was the first to report observations that contradicted the institution's carefully maintained image. Dutch had been making deliveries to St. Augustine's for 3 years, developing a routine familiarity that allowed him to notice subtle changes over time. The boys used to run to the windows when they heard my wagon coming up the drive, Dutch recalled in his testimony. They'd wave and call out questions about news from town, beg for stories about their families. Normal boy behavior. But over the past year, that all stopped. Now when I arrive, the windows are empty. If I do see students, they move like sleepwalkers, never acknowledging my presence. Dutch's observations extended beyond student behavior to include details about the unusual nature of materials being delivered to the school. His manifest showed regular shipments of items that seemed inappropriate for an educational institution. Surgical instruments, chemical compounds, and specialized equipment that belonged more properly in a medical facility. When Dutch questioned these deliveries, he was told they were necessary for advanced vocal conditioning programs and warned that discussing school business would result in immediate termination. More disturbing still were Dutch's accounts of sounds that emanated from the basement levels during nighttime deliveries. The school often requested that certain sensitive materials be delivered after dark. During these evening visits, Dutch reported hearing sounds that defied explanation. Mechanical noises like drilling or sawing, punctuated by brief periods of what he could only describe as muffled screaming that was quickly cut off. I asked Brother Thomas about the noises, Dutch testified. He explained they were conducting intensive vocal exercises that required complete acoustic isolation. Said the sounds I heard were students learning to project their voices through specialized equipment. But I've heard machinery, and I've heard human suffering. What comes from that basement isn't music practice. Martha Goodwin, whose position as seamstress required regular visits to the school for uniform fittings and repairs, provided even more detailed observations of the changes occurring among the student population. Her work brought her into direct contact with the boys weekly, allowing her to document the systematic transformation of normal children into eerily uniform figures. When I first started working at the school, Martha reported, the boys were lively and mischievous, as all boys should be. They'd fidget during fittings, ask questions about the outside world, sometimes sneak extra food from my basket. Each child had his own personality. Over time, those individual traits just disappeared. Martha's seamstress duties required precise measurements of each student, giving her unique insights into physical changes accompanying their behavioral transformation. She noticed scarring patterns on several boys' scalps, usually hidden beneath carefully combed hair, but visible during close examination. The scars formed consistent patterns that suggested deliberate surgical procedures rather than accidental injuries. Most troubling were Martha's observations of students who seemed to be in various stages of what she termed conditioning. Some boys retained traces of their original personalities, but moved with increasing stiffness. Others had progressed to perpetual trance states, responding to direct commands but showing no initiative. A few had achieved the perfect uniformity that characterized the school's most successful students. Children transformed into flawless instruments of musical performance while losing everything that had once made them human. The first hint of hidden chambers beneath the school came from William Hartley, a mason hired to repair winter frost damage to the building's foundation. Hartley's work required him to examine the basement levels more thoroughly than any outsider had been permitted since the school's construction. The basement isn't just storage and utility rooms like they showed Inspector Whitmore, Hartley reported to local authorities. There's a whole network of chambers down there, connected by passages that extend far beyond the building's visible footprint. Some of the rooms are fitted out like hospital operating theaters, with drainage systems and ventilation that could handle procedures producing significant amounts of blood and other fluids. Hartley's expertise allowed him to recognize that the basement infrastructure had been planned from the school's initial design rather than added later. The hidden chambers weren't afterthoughts. They were purpose-built facilities designed to support activities that required complete secrecy and acoustic isolation. Most damning was Hartley's discovery of specialized equipment that had no place in any legitimate educational institution. Hidden chambers contained restraining devices designed to immobilize human subjects with medical precision. Surgical tables were equipped with drainage systems that could handle substantial fluid volumes. Complex ventilation systems ensured that sounds from these chambers would never reach the building's upper levels. Whatever's happening in those basement rooms, Hartley concluded grimly, it's been planned for years. This isn't random cruelty or educational discipline gone wrong. It's systematic, scientific, and designed to continue indefinitely without detection. The true horror of saying Augustine's vocal conditioning program emerged through a combination of stolen documents, escaped victims, and testimony of individuals who had witnessed procedures they were never meant to see. What these sources revealed was a systematic program of human experimentation that pushed the boundaries of medical science in service of an obsession with vocal perfection that had consumed the school's leadership completely. The program began with careful selection of students who possessed exceptional natural vocal abilities. These boys were identified through auditions that tested not only musical talent, but psychological profile and physical characteristics. Candidates needed to demonstrate both vocal potential and personality traits that would make them susceptible to the conditioning process. Typically sensitive, intelligent children who craved approval and feared abandonment. Once selected, students underwent what the school termed preliminary conditioning, a period of intensive psychological manipulation designed to break down their resistance to authority and establish absolute dependence on their instructors. This phase involved isolation from other students, carefully controlled nutrition that affected brain chemistry, and constant bombardment with religious messages that equated obedience with salvation and resistance with damnation. Students who successfully completed preliminary conditioning were deemed ready for the physical interventions that formed the core of the vocal conditioning program. These procedures, conducted in the hidden basement chambers under conditions of absolute secrecy, involved direct surgical modification of the vocal apparatus combined with experimental techniques designed to prevent the natural changes that occurred during puberty. Master Finch had developed a sophisticated understanding of vocal anatomy through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects. His surgical techniques included procedures for modifying the larynx to produce specific tonal qualities, altering the respiratory system to increase breath control, and most horrifically, interventions in the brain designed to eliminate personality traits that interfered with perfect vocal performance. The surgical modifications were conducted without proper anesthesia, partly due to the need to monitor vocal responses during the procedures, but primarily because the school's leadership believed that suffering was an essential component of spiritual purification. Students were kept conscious throughout operations that lasted for hours, their screams muffled by the basement chamber's acoustic isolation. Brother Thomas served as both surgeon and spiritual advisor during these procedures, combining his medical training with twisted theological justifications for the horrors being inflicted. He spoke to his victims throughout their ordeal, explaining that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice for the greater glory of divine music. Those who survived the initial surgeries with their voices enhanced were praised as chosen vessels. Those who died were honored as martyrs, whose sacrifice had advanced the sacred science of vocal perfection. The most successful subjects of the vocal conditioning program underwent a final phase that the school's leadership termed ascension. These procedures involved the most extreme surgical modifications, designed to preserve perfect voices indefinitely by preventing any further physical or psychological development. Students who achieved this ultimate state of conditioning became the school's greatest treasures, living instruments capable of producing sounds of supernatural beauty, but completely devoid of human consciousness or individual will. The ascension rituals were conducted with religious ceremony that transformed medical procedures into acts of worship. Students selected for this ultimate honor were told they were being prepared to join the heavenly choir, their earthly identities dissolved into pure musical expression. The procedures that followed were so extreme that few subjects survived, but those who did achieved the perfect vocal control that represented the culmination of the school's dark mission. The bodies of students who died during the conditioning process were not disposed of, but preserved for ongoing study. Master Finch maintained an extensive collection of anatomical specimens that documented the effects of various surgical techniques on vocal production. These preserved remains, floating in chemical solutions in hidden chambers beneath the school, represented years of experimentation that had gradually refined the techniques used on subsequent victims. The walls of silence surrounding St. Augustine's began to crumble in March 1876, when a fire in Master Finch's private study exposed the meticulous documentation of his unholy experiments. The blaze, started by an overturned oil lamp during one of Finch's late-night research sessions, consumed most of the room's contents before being extinguished. However, investigators discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall that had protected the most damning evidence from the flames. The recovered documents painted a picture of systematic human experimentation that exceeded the darkest imaginings of those who had suspected something was amiss at the prestigious choir school. Finch's personal journals, written in precise script that betrayed no emotion despite describing unspeakable horrors, detailed surgical procedures conducted on dozens of students over the course of nearly a decade. The earliest entries, dating back to 1867, showed tentative experiments with vocal cord modifications performed on students who had shown resistance to conventional training methods. Finch recorded the effects of various incisions and adjustments with clinical detachment, noting how different surgical approaches affected tone quality, pitch range, and vocal endurance. What began as crude attempts to enhance natural abilities gradually evolved into sophisticated procedures that could transform ordinary voices into instruments of supernatural beauty. One particularly chilling entry described the case of Master Edward Brightwater, a 12-year-old boy whose pure soprano voice had begun showing signs of the inevitable deepening that marked the onset of adolescence. Rather than accept this natural process, Finch had performed an experimental procedure designed to prevent the physical changes that would destroy the child's angelic tone. Subject's laryngeal cartilage successfully modified through precise incision and chemical treatment, Finch wrote with scientific satisfaction. Vocal cords maintained in pre-adolescent configuration despite subject's chronological age advancing to 14 years. Tonal purity preserved indefinitely through elimination of natural hormonal influences. Subject displays complete compliance with musical direction and shows no memory of pre-procedure personality traits that interfered with perfect performance. The journals revealed that Edward's success had encouraged Finch to develop increasingly extreme methods for preserving and enhancing young voices. Subsequent entries describe procedures that went far beyond simple vocal modification to include surgical interventions in the brain designed to eliminate what Finch termed personality interference with musical perfection. Supply records discovered in the same hidden compartment showed regular orders for medical equipment that had no legitimate place in an educational institution. Chemical compounds used for preserving biological specimens, surgical instruments designed for delicate cranial work, and restraining devices that could immobilize subjects during extended procedures painted a picture of an operation that was far more medical laboratory than music school. Perhaps most damning of all were the correspondence files that revealed St. Augustine's participation in an international network of researchers conducting illegal human experimentation. Letters from European physicians and anatomists discussed the purchase of detailed surgical documentation and preserved specimens with the casual tone of routine business transactions. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of Vienna's Imperial Medical Institute had been a particularly avid customer, paying substantial sums for Finch's research into what he termed vocal preservation through cranial intervention. His letters specifically requested documentation of procedures that could eliminate memory, suppress personality development, and maintain childlike vocal qualities in subjects well beyond normal physical maturation. Your techniques for achieving permanent vocal stasis represent a breakthrough that our legitimate researchers could never accomplish through ethical means, Zimmerman wrote in one intercepted letter. The specimens you have provided demonstrate effects that we previously considered impossible. I am prepared to offer significant compensation for exclusive access to your most advanced methodologies. The financial records discovered alongside these documents showed that St. Augustine's had generated enormous profits from selling experimental data and preserved anatomical specimens to researchers throughout Europe and America. The school's reputation for musical excellence had provided perfect cover for a commercial enterprise based on systematic torture and murder of children. When local authorities finally obtained warrants to search the school's premises in April 1876, they discovered physical evidence that confirmed the horrific details documented in Finch's journals. The basement chambers contained surgical equipment that belonged more properly in the most advanced medical facilities of the era. Operating tables equipped with restraints designed to immobilize subjects completely were positioned beneath powerful oil lamps that could provide the illumination necessary for delicate procedures. The most horrifying discovery came in a sealed chamber that had been hidden behind a false wall in the basement's deepest level. Glass containers filled with preservative solutions held specimens that investigators initially mistook for animal organs until closer examination revealed their true nature. Dozens of human larynxes, vocal cords, and related anatomical structures floated in chemical baths, each labeled with detailed information about the surgical procedures that had been performed and the acoustic properties that had been achieved. A separate collection contained what appeared to be brain tissue samples, carefully sectioned and preserved with annotations describing their relationship to specific personality traits and behavioral modifications. The clinical precision with which these specimens had been prepared and cataloged suggested years of systematic experimentation conducted with scientific methodology applied to fundamentally evil purposes. The investigators also discovered extensive documentation of the school's ascension ceremonies, revealing them to be elaborate rituals designed to mask the murder of students who had been subjected to the most extreme experimental procedures. Boys who achieved what Finch considered perfect vocal conditioning were killed during ceremonies that presented their deaths as spiritual transcendence to higher realms of existence. The exposure of sane. Augustine's horrors triggered the largest criminal investigation in New York State's history up to that time. Federal marshals joined local authorities in a manhunt for the school's leadership, though by the time warrants were issued, Headmaster Thorne, Master Finch, and Brother Thomas had vanished without a trace. Their escape had been carefully planned, with evidence suggesting they had maintained multiple safe houses and false identities for precisely such an eventuality. The investigation revealed that over the course of nearly a decade, at least 200 boys had been subjected to various forms of experimental procedures at St. Augustine's. Of these, fewer than half had survived to be returned to their families, and those who did return bore permanent physical and psychological damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The remainder had either died during the procedures or been murdered during the ascension ceremonies that marked the completion of their conditioning. However, the full scope of the crimes was never officially acknowledged. Powerful families whose sons had attended the school used their influence to limit the investigation and suppress evidence that would have exposed their complicity in the horrors. The official records were sealed, and the few journalists who attempted to report on the case found themselves facing legal challenges that effectively silenced their efforts. The Catholic Church, which had provided ecclesiastical authorization for the school's operations, conducted its own internal investigation that concluded the institution had been infiltrated by individuals who had corrupted its noble mission. The church's report, never made public, placed blame on the personal moral failings of the school's leadership, while absolving the ecclesiastical hierarchy of any responsibility for oversight failures that had enabled the crimes to continue for years. Most tragically, the conspiracy of silence extended to the families of victims who chose to protect their social standing, rather than seek justice for their murdered children. The stigma associated with having sent a son to Sony, Augustine's, was considered so damaging that most parents preferred to maintain the fiction that their children had died in accidents or from illnesses, rather than acknowledge they had been victims of systematic abuse. The lasting impact of St. Augustine's experiments extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence medical research for decades. The knowledge gained through torture and murder of children was incorporated into legitimate academic studies without acknowledgement of its horrific origins. Surgical techniques developed through unrestricted human experimentation advanced the field of vocal medicine while the means of their discovery remained hidden in classified archives. The three perpetrators were never captured, though unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations throughout the Americas and Europe in subsequent years. Some investigators believed they continued their work under different identities, while others suspected they had been eliminated by associates seeking to prevent exposure of the international network that had supported their crimes. The abandoned school building stood empty for several years before being destroyed by a fire that local residents widely suspected was deliberately set. The community's desire to erase all physical evidence of the horrors that had occurred there reflected a broader pattern of willful forgetting that characterized society's response to the case. What remains is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the willingness of civilized society to ignore uncomfortable truths when confronting them would require acknowledgement of collective complicity. The children who died at St. Augustine's were victims not only of three sadistic individuals, but of a system that valued reputation and respectability more than human life. The perfect voices that once echoed through those stone halls were purchased with the souls of innocents whose only crime was possessing the natural gifts that made them targets for exploitation. In our pursuit of beauty and perfection, we must never forget the price that was paid by those whose screams were silenced forever, in service of an ideal that had become monstrous in its single-minded dedication. The mystery of the Holloway choir boys serves as a reminder that the most profound horrors are often hidden behind facades of respectability and noble purpose. When we cease to question authority, when we allow prestige to substitute for oversight, when we choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, we create the conditions that make such atrocities possible. The angelic voices of St. Augustine's will echo through history as a warning that evil can flourish wherever good people choose to remain silent.